It was just another routine flight. The passengers were settling into their seats, some flipping through magazines, others drifting into sleep as the plane cut through the clouds. The flight attendants made their rounds, offering drinks and snacks, and everything seemed perfectly normal. But that calm, everyday atmosphere soon shifted when a flight attendant noticed something odd about one of the passengers, a young boy traveling alone. At first glance, he didn't stand out. He was sitting quietly near the back of the plane, staring out the window. He didn't fidget like some kids do on long flights, and he wasn't asking for anything. He just sat there, watching the world below. But as one of the attendants passed by his seat, she felt something strange. It was hard to put into words, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. She glanced at the boy, her eyes lingering for a moment longer than usual, trying to figure out what was making her uneasy. Was it his stillness? The way he seemed detached from everything happening around him? She brushed it off, continuing her duties, but the feeling gnawed at her. She wasn't the only one who noticed either. A second flight attendant, moving through the aisle, also found herself drawn to the boy's seat. There was something off, something she couldn't explain. They exchanged uneasy glances, quietly agreeing that something was worth looking into. It wasn't until one of them walked past the boy again and caught sight of his feet that everything changed. She froze for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. She quickly stepped back, taking a second look to make sure she wasn't imagining things. What she saw made her blood run cold. She leaned over to her colleague, whispering urgently. Without a word, they both knew this was serious. The two attendants moved quickly, but quietly, trying not to alarm the other passengers. They had to get the pilot involved. Whatever was happening needed immediate attention. As they headed to the cockpit, their minds raced with questions. Who was this boy? Why was he traveling alone? And more importantly, what was wrong with him? They knocked on the cockpit door, their voices steady, but filled with urgency as they relayed what they had seen. The captain listened carefully, his face growing more serious by the second. He asked the attendants to stay calm and return to the cabin while he made a decision. Minutes felt like hours as they waited. The tension on board was rising, though most of the passengers remained blissfully unaware. But in the front of the plane, in the cockpit, the pilot was faced with an impossible choice. Something was terribly wrong, and it was happening right under their noses at 30,000 feet. Should he continue the flight and hope for the best? Or should he take drastic action and land the plane as soon as possible? The attendants returned to their stations, their nerves frayed. They couldn't shake the image of the boy's feet from their minds. What had they stumbled upon? And what would happen next? Just then, the intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. He had made his decision. The captain's voice over the intercom was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor issue, and, as a precaution, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport. We appreciate your cooperation. Most passengers didn't think much of it. After all, unexpected landings happen. But for the flight attendants and the captain, this was far from routine. In the cockpit, the captain was already in contact with air traffic control, arranging an emergency landing. He had been flying for years, dealt with countless situations, but something about this one felt different. The flight attendants had explained what they saw, how the boy's feet didn't look normal, like something was seriously wrong. But what exactly? They couldn't say. They only knew they had to act quickly. Meanwhile, the boy sat quietly in his seat, still staring out the window, oblivious to the growing concern around him. He seemed calm, too calm for a child traveling alone. His expression was blank, almost distant, as if he wasn't fully aware of his surroundings. Other passengers, slowly picking up on the unusual tension, began to whisper, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected announcement. The flight attendants, now trying to maintain control over their own nerves, watched the boy closely. They had gone over to check on him earlier, asking if he needed anything. His response was odd. He barely looked at them, just shook his head and mumbled something. They couldn't quite make out. When they asked for his name, he hesitated before answering, his voice quiet and flat. The name didn't match the one on the passenger manifest. And then, there were his feet. They couldn't shake the image. His shoes were oversized, like they didn't belong to him. And there was something off about how his legs looked, underneath the fabric of his pants. It wasn't just the wrong shoes. It was as if his legs were swollen, or wrong. As the plane began to descend, the cabin grew tense. The passengers didn't know the full story, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. The boy remained motionless, still staring into the clouds, almost too still for a child his age. It was as if he was detached from the world around him, lost in his own thoughts, or something worse. The flight attendants quietly informed a few passengers near the boy to stay calm and remain seated until they landed. They didn't give details, just said there was a minor situation. The passengers, sensing something was off, did as they were told, but the worry in their eyes was impossible to hide. Whispers rippled through the rows. A few began to speculate. Was it a medical emergency? Was the boy sick? But the truth was stranger than anyone on board could have imagined. As the plane prepared to touch down, the captain's focus was razor sharp. They needed to land safely and get help immediately. He wasn't sure what they were dealing with, but he knew it wasn't something he could ignore. The flight attendants were instructed to keep a close watch on the boy, though no one wanted to alarm him just yet. Suddenly the boy shifted. For the first time in hours, he moved, slowly turning away from the window. His expression remained blank, his eyes dull. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but to the flight attendants, it felt like the calm before the storm. They couldn't help but wonder, what was wrong with him? Was he in danger? Or was he the danger? As the plane descended further, the boy's stillness became unsettling. One of the attendants approached again, kneeling by his seat, trying to gently engage him. "Are you feeling okay? We're about to land, just hang in there." She offered a reassuring smile, but the boy's response was chilling. He looked at her, his eyes dull and unblinking, and whispered, "It's too late." Those words echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. What did he mean? Was he trying to warn them? Or was there something darker at play? The attendant quickly backed away, her heart pounding as she returned to her colleagues. They exchanged worried glances, their earlier suspicions growing stronger. Finally, the plane touched down on the runway, bouncing slightly before slowing to a smooth stop. The tension in the cabin was palpable. The passengers were still mostly in the dark, but the unusual landing, the nervous glances from the flight crew, and the strange atmosphere around the boy were starting to stir panic. Emergency personnel were already waiting on the tarmac. As soon as the doors opened, a group of paramedics and security officers boarded the plane. The passengers, now fully alert, watched in stunned silence as they approached the boy's seat. They didn't know what to expect, but the flight attendants had already briefed the responders on what little they knew. The paramedics gently asked the boy to stand up, but he remained still. One of them crouched down to take a closer look at his feet. As they lifted the hem of his pants, their eyes widened in shock. Something was seriously wrong. The boy wasn't just ill. There was something unnatural about his legs, something that didn't belong. The crew and passengers watched, frozen in their seats as the paramedics carefully lifted the boy, his body unnervingly limp, as they carried him toward the exit. The entire cabin was gripped with a sense of dread. What was happening? What had they just witnessed? And as the boy was taken off the plane, one question hung in the air, unanswered. What did he mean when he said, "It's too late"? The truth, it seemed, was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined, and they were about to find out as the paramedics rushed the boy down the plane's aisle. The cabin fell into a thick, eerie silence. The other passengers, their eyes wide with confusion and fear, could only watch in disbelief. No one understood what was happening, but everyone felt the weight of something far from ordinary. The flight attendants, still shaken by the boy's cryptic words, "It's too late," stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The boy, still limp in the arms of the paramedics, didn't resist to speak as they carried him down the steps, onto the tarmac. His legs hung awkwardly, confirming what the attendants had feared. There was something wrong with him, something more than illness. His oversized shoes had concealed his swollen, misshapen feet, which now looked even more unnatural under the harsh airport lights. Outside, the airport crew, who had been notified about a potential emergency, surrounded the boy and the medics. A team of doctors, police officers, and security guards all crowded around, asking questions, trying to assess the situation. But the boy remained eerily silent, his expression blank, as if he wasn't truly there. Back on the plane, the passengers exchanged murmurs, trying to piece together what little they knew. Why had the plane landed so abruptly? What was wrong with the boy? Speculation ran wild. Some thought he was sick. Others whispered about something more sinister. The flight attendants, now gathered near the front of the plane, recounted what they had seen to the authorities. One of them mentioned the boy's strange, cold demeanor and his haunting words. The police officer took note, his brow furrowed with concern. Something wasn't adding up. The boy had no identification on him, and his name didn't match any official records. Outside, the doctors began running tests, checking the boy's vitals, trying to understand what was happening. His body temperature was dangerously low, and his heart rate was irregular. But beyond the physical signs, there was something deeply unsettling about him, something that no medical instrument could detect. The doctors exchanged worried glances. Was this a medical mystery, or something more? Suddenly, as if snapping out of a daze, the boy's eyes focused. He blinked a few times, seeming to come back to life. The paramedic stepped back, startled by the sudden change. The boy sat up, his expression shifting from blank to alert, though still oddly calm for a child in his position. "Where am I?" he asked quietly, his voice soft but clear. The paramedics exchanged glances. "You're at the airport. You weren't feeling well, so we brought you here to make sure you're okay." The boy's eyes darted around, taking in the scene, the medics, the flashing lights, the crowd of concerned faces. And then, without warning, he smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile that offered comfort. It was cold, detached. He looked directly at the paramedics and whispered again, "It's too late." Before anyone could react, alarms from one of the medical devices began to beep frantically. The boy's heart rate had spiked, far beyond normal levels. The doctors rushed in, trying to stabilize him, but it was as if his body was shutting down. His eyes rolled back, and his breathing grew shallow. In a matter of seconds, the boy collapsed again, his body limp and lifeless. Chaos erupted. The doctors scrambled, performing CPR, while security rushed to clear the area. But no matter what they did, the boy remained unresponsive. It was as though whatever life had been left in him was fading fast. and no one could stop it. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the boy's body went still. The doctors stopped, stepping back as a somber realization settled over them. The boy was gone. The paramedics, shaken and unsure of what had just happened, stood in silence. The police, trying to understand the situation, began asking more questions. But the truth was, no one had answers. Who was this boy? What had he meant by, "It's too late"? And why had he deteriorated so suddenly? Back on the plane, the passengers were eventually allowed to disembark. Many of them were still confused, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. The flight attendants, still reeling from the strange events, did their best to reassure everyone. But deep down, they knew something about that flight would haunt them for a long time. In the days that followed, investigators tried to piece together the boy's story. They looked into his background, searched for family or friends, but came up empty. His records were incomplete. His identity, a mystery. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere, and as the authorities dug deeper, more questions emerged. Why had he been on that flight alone? What had happened to him before he boarded? And most chilling of all, what had he meant by those final words? Though the official reports labeled it as a tragic medical case, those who had been there knew there was something more, something they couldn't explain. It left a mark on everyone involved, a lingering feeling that the story wasn't over. Even after the plane had landed and life had returned to normal, the mystery of the boy stayed with them. And as for the boy's final words, "It's too late," no one would ever know what he truly meant, or why those words still echoed in their minds long after he was gone. But one thing was certain. That flight had been far from ordinary, and for those who were there, it was something they would never forget.